Forget everything you thought you knew about fairy tale weddings. Imagine a bride and groom still in their toddler years being formally promised to each other for life, their tiny hands perhaps joined by ambitious parents. Picture a wedding where the actual groom wasn't even in the same country, so a loyal representative had to symbolically lie in bed with the new bride, often with a naked sword separating them as a sign of platonic duty. Or consider the delightful medieval tradition where, if the local community didn't approve of your marriage, maybe you were too old, or she was marrying too soon after her last husband kicked the bucket, they'd gather outside your window on your wedding night, banging pots and pans, and screaming insults until dawn. Medieval folks had some seriously peculiar ways of saying, "I do." And these are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to their marriage rituals and customs that make modern dating disasters look like a walk in the park. Get ready to explore a world where wedding bells sometimes sounded more like alarm bells. Number 11. Divorce by combat. The ultimate marital spat. Believe it or not, in some parts of medieval Germanic Europe, if a husband and wife just couldn't see eye to eye anymore, they could, under certain circumstances, settle their differences with a good old-fashioned duel. This wasn't just a random brawl. It was a legally sanctioned procedure, a trial by combat specifically for marital disputes. The rules were quite specific and, frankly, bizarre. The man was typically placed in a pit dug up to his waist, making him a restricted target. He was often armed with a club or cudgel. The woman, on the other hand, was usually free to move around the edge of the pit. Her weapon, often a chemise or a piece of cloth with a stone weighing a few pounds sewn into the end, which she could swing like a makeshift flail. The idea was that God would favor the righteous party, ensuring victory for whoever was in the right. If the man touched the edge of the pit with his hand or arm, he lost. If the woman was dragged into the pit by the man, she might lose, or if he managed to subdue her. The loser, if they survived the fight, could face severe penalties, sometimes even execution, especially if the dispute involved serious accusations like infidelity that led to the desire for separation. While not an everyday occurrence, the fact that detailed rules for such duels existed in legal texts, like Hans Talhofer's Fechtbuch, fight book, from the 15th century, shows it was a recognized, albeit extreme, way to end a marriage or settle a grave marital accusation. It certainly gives a whole new meaning to fighting for your marriage, or in this case, fighting to get out of it. Number 10. Marrying the dead till death. Do us. Oh wait. You might think marriage vows are pretty clear on the till death do us part clause, but medieval minds sometimes had other ideas. Posthumous marriages where one of the parties was deceased did happen, though they were rare and usually served very specific, often pragmatic purposes. Imagine a noblewoman betrothed to a prince who dies before the wedding. To solidify an alliance or ensure the terms of a treaty linked to the marriage were upheld, a ceremony might still take place with a proxy standing in for the deceased groom or vows exchanged over his tomb. More commonly, such unions were about legitimacy and inheritance. If a man died leaving his pregnant partner unwed, a posthumous marriage could legitimize their child, allowing the offspring to inherit titles and property. This was incredibly important in a society obsessed with lineage and rightful succession. Sometimes, a long-standing promise of marriage might be fulfilled after death to honor the deceased or to ensure the spiritual well-being of the souls involved, according to the beliefs of the time. The ceremony itself would have been adapted. Perhaps the living spouse would make vows beside the coffin, or an effigy of the deceased. While the church had complex views on the sacraments and the dead, social and legal pressures occasionally led to these unusual unions. It wasn't about romance with a ghost, but about solving very real earthly problems of lineage, property, and honor, even if it meant saying "I do" to someone already in the afterlife. Number 9. The not-so-sweet cake smash. Breaking bread over the bride. Long before elaborate, tiered wedding cakes became the norm, a much simpler and perhaps messier tradition involving baked goods was common at medieval weddings. This wasn't about a delicate slice shared by the happy couple. It was about breaking bread, or small wheat, or barley cakes directly over the bride's head. This act was steeped in ancient symbolism, primarily connected to fertility and prosperity. Wheat, a staple of life, represented abundance and the hope for a fruitful union, meaning lots of children to help on the farm or carry on the family name. As the bread or cake was broken, crumbs would shower down onto the bride and sometimes the groom. Guests would then scramble to pick up these fallen crumbs, as they were believed to bring good luck. It was a communal blessing, wishing the couple a life filled with plenty and good fortune. This ritual, with roots stretching back to Roman times, where a barley cake was broken over the bride's head, evolved through the medieval period. Sometimes, small sweet buns or biscuits were stacked high, and the couple would try to kiss over the pile without knocking it down. If they succeeded, a lifetime of prosperity was foretold. These traditions highlight how central the ideas of fertility, sustenance, and community blessing were to the concept of marriage. It was a far cry from a careful cake cutting, more of a boisterous, hopeful, and slightly crumbly affair. Number 8. Hand over the shoe. Who wears the trousers, or sandals? In many cultures, shoes hold symbolic meaning, and medieval Europe was no exception, especially when it came to weddings. One particularly telling custom was the symbolic handing over of a shoe. This often involved the bride's father presenting one of her shoes to the groom, during or after the wedding ceremony. This act wasn't just about footwear. It represented a significant transfer of authority. The father who previously held authority over his daughter was now formally passing that responsibility and control to her new husband. The shoe symbolized dominion and possession. In some variations of this custom, the groom might then lightly tap the bride on the head or shoulder with the shoe, a gesture signifying his newly acquired authority over her. While this might seem demeaning to modern eyes, in the context of a patriarchal medieval society, it was a clear visual statement of the legal and social shift occurring. The bride was moving from her father's household and protection to her husband's. This ritual could also have undertones of ensuring the bride's obedience and her integration into her new family structure. The specific details varied by region and social class, but the core message of transferring authority through the symbol of a shoe was quite widespread. It's a stark reminder of how marriage was often viewed less as a partnership of equals and more as a formal transfer of a woman from one male authority figure to another. Number 7. The mock capture runaway bride. For real. Sort of. Medieval weddings sometimes included a playful ritualized enactment of a bride capture. This wasn't usually a genuine abduction, but rather a symbolic performance echoing much older and sometimes more forceful traditions of bride kidnapping found in various cultures. In its medieval form, this custom often involved the groom and his party staging a mock pursuit or abduction of the bride from her family's home. There might be feigned resistance from the bride's relatives or friends, adding to the drama and festivity of the occasion. This charade served several symbolic purposes. It emphasized the bride's transition from her natal family to her husband's lineage and household, a significant and sometimes emotionally charged move. The capture could also symbolize the groom's prowess and determination in winning his bride. For the bride, it might have been a way to show a token, culturally expected reluctance to leave her family, even if the marriage was desired and arranged. These mock captures were generally festive and integrated into the broader wedding celebrations, transforming a potentially ancient and aggressive practice into a piece of communal theater. It highlighted the communal nature of marriage, where the joining of two individuals was also a restructuring of relationships between two families. It was less about actual force and more about acknowledging, through ritual, the profound change in status and allegiance the bride was undergoing. Number 6. Trial by ordeal for an accused wife. God as the ultimate judge. And it was terrifying. Marriage in the Middle Ages was a sacred vow, and adultery, especially by a wife, was considered a grievous sin and a serious social offense that could threaten lineage and inheritance. But what happened if a wife was accused of infidelity without clear proof or eyewitnesses? In some cases, particularly in earlier medieval periods or in regions where customary law held sway, the accused woman might be subjected to a trial by ordeal. This wasn't a trial in the modern sense, with evidence and lawyers. It was a physical test where the outcome was believed to reveal God's judgment. Common forms of ordeal included carrying a red-hot piece of iron for a set distance, or plunging an arm into boiling water to retrieve a stone. After a few days, the wound would be examined. If it was healing cleanly, she was deemed innocent, protected by God. If it was festering and infected, which, given the lack of sanitation and medical knowledge, was highly likely, she was considered guilty. Another form was the ordeal of cold water. The accused was bound and thrown into consecrated water. If she sank, she was innocent, and hopefully rescued before drowning. If she floated, the pure water was seen as rejecting her, proving her guilt. The logic was that God would not allow an innocent person to suffer, nor a guilty one to escape. In reality, these ordeals were brutal, terrifying, and often a death sentence or a path to severe injury and public shame, regardless of actual guilt. While the Church eventually moved to discourage ordeals by the 13th century, favoring more rational forms of evidence, the very existence of such practices because the extreme measures taken to enforce marital fidelity and the terrifying power imbalances within medieval society. Number 5. Charivari, your neighbors, HATED, this wedding. If you thought navigating family opinions about your choice of partner was tough today, imagine having the entire village publicly shame you if they disapproved of your marriage. This was the reality of the Charivari, or rough music, skimmington, or various other local names, in medieval and early modern Europe. A charivari was a noisy public demonstration of communal disapproval, often directed at marriages that violated social norms. What kind of unions would trigger such a response? Remarriage of widows or widowers, especially if it was deemed too soon after their spouse's death, or if there was a significant age gap, an old man marrying a young woman or vice versa. Marriages where one partner was an outsider to the community, or unions tainted by adultery or cuckoldry, were also prime targets. The charivari itself was a cacophonous affair. Villagers would gather outside the offending couple's house, often at night banging pots, pans, bells, and anything else that could make a racket. They would shout insults, sing lewd or mocking songs, and sometimes parade effigies of the couple engaging in shameful acts. Sometimes, a ride of shame was staged, with someone dressed as the offending party paraded backwards on a donkey. While it could sometimes have a playful, almost carnivalesque edge, charivari could also be genuinely menacing, involving property damage or minor assaults. It was a powerful form of social control, a way for the community to enforce its unwritten rules about acceptable unions and to publicly humiliate those who stepped out of line. It showed that marriage wasn't just a private affair, but a public concern. Number 4. Bundling, getting cozy, with a board in between. In an age before central heating, and with courtship often constrained by strict social rules, a peculiar custom known as bundling emerged in some rural parts of Europe, and later colonial America. Bundling allowed a courting couple to spend the night together in the same bed, but with a catch. They were supposed to remain fully clothed, and often a physical barrier, like a bundling board or a long bolster, was placed down the middle of the bed to separate them. Sometimes the young woman might even be enclosed in a bundling bag or have her legs tied together. The practical reasons were partly to save on firewood and candles, as the couple could share warmth and chat in the dark, without needing separate rooms or chaperones staying up late. It was seen as a way for young people to get to know each other and develop intimacy in a controlled manner, theoretically stopping short of premarital sex. However, human nature being what it is, bundling boards weren't always effective deterrents. The high rates of premarital pregnancies in areas where bundling was common suggested the physical barriers were sometimes ignored or overcome. While some religious authorities condemned the practice as an invitation to sin, in many tight-knit communities, it was a tolerated, if somewhat risky, part of the courting process. It represented a strange compromise between the desire for young people to connect and the societal imperative to maintain premarital chastity, a kind of chaperoned intimacy that often tested the boundaries of propriety. Number 3. Placid power. I marry you, via my cousin's best friend. For the medieval elite, royalty, and high nobility, marriage was often less about love and more about politics. Dynastic alliances, peace treaties, and the consolidation of territories were frequently sealed with a wedding. But what if the bride and groom lived hundreds of miles apart, or one was too young to travel, or political instability made the journey unsafe? The solution was marriage by proxy. This legally binding ceremony allowed one or even both parties to be represented by a stand-in. A trusted nobleman would act on behalf of the absent groom or a lady-in-waiting for the absent bride. This representative would speak the vows, exchange the rings, and go through all the formal motions of the wedding ceremony. The most eyebrow-raising part of a proxy marriage, however, was often the symbolic consummation. To demonstrate that the marriage was, in all but physical presence, complete, the proxy, usually the groom's representative, might be required to participate in a ritual bedding with the present bride. This didn't mean actual consummation with the proxy. Instead, the proxy, fully clothed or sometimes with one leg bared to touch the bride's, would lie down on the marriage bed beside the bride. Crucially, a naked sword was often placed between them, symbolizing that the act was purely ceremonial and that the bride's chastity was being preserved for her actual husband. Witnesses, including clergy and nobles, would be present to attest to this symbolic act. Famous examples include the marriage of Mary Tudor to Louis XII of France, where the Duke of Longueville acted as proxy for the aging king. It was a pragmatic solution to the logistical and political challenges of aristocratic matchmaking. Number 2. Tiny tots tying the knot. Child marriages were a thing. The concept of childhood in the Middle Ages was very different from ours, and this is starkly illustrated by the practice of child betrothal and marriage. It wasn't uncommon for children, sometimes as young as infants or toddlers, to be formally promised or even married to each other. These arrangements were almost exclusively about strategic alliances between powerful families, securing property, consolidating land, or ensuring political allegiances for generations to come. The children themselves had absolutely no say in the matter. They were pawns in the dynastic games of their parents. A betrothal, a formal promise to marry, could occur at any age, even in the cradle. While the church stipulated that a true sacramental marriage required consent and could only be consummated after the parties reached the age of puberty, defined as around 12 for girls and 14 for boys, these rules were often bent or overlooked, especially among the nobility. A marriage ceremony might take place with young children who barely understood what was happening. They would exchange vows, often coached by their parents. These unions were typically not consummated until the children were deemed physically mature, but they were legally binding in terms of inheritance and alliance. Imagine a 7-year-old girl being formally addressed as wife and sent to live in the household of her future husband's family to be raised as their future daughter-in-law. The emotional and psychological impact on these children can only be guessed at. While some of these child marriages were later annulled if one party refused to consent upon reaching maturity, many went ahead shaping lives based on decisions made before they could even speak. Number 1. The public bedding ceremony, and the whole town came to watch. If you think wedding night jitters are bad, imagine having a crowd of people escort you to your bedroom and practically tuck you in. The public bedding ceremony was a widespread and significant ritual in medieval European marriages, especially for the nobility, but also practiced in various forms by other social classes. After the wedding feast and celebrations, the bride and groom were ceremoniously led to their marriage chamber by a procession of family friends, and sometimes even the priest and other community members. This wasn't a quiet, private moment. The atmosphere could be boisterous, filled with music, jokes, often bawdy, and toasts wishing the couple fertility and happiness. Once in the bedchamber, the couple might be helped to undress by their attendants. Prayers might be said, and the bed blessed by the priest to ensure a fruitful union and ward off evil spirits or impotence. The assembled company would then witness the couple getting into bed together. While they didn't typically stay to watch the actual consummation, though for some royal marriages, a high degree of proof was sometimes desired for dynastic reasons, their presence at the threshold of the act was crucial. This public witnessing served a vital legal and social purpose. It provided irrefutable proof that the marriage had been completed, at least symbolically, by the couple entering the marriage bed. In an era before widespread written records for common folk, this public testimony was essential to validate the marriage and, crucially, the legitimacy of any future children, particularly heirs to titles and property. It might seem incredibly invasive and embarrassing by today's standards, but for medieval society it was a fundamental step in making a marriage official and recognized by the community.